Well, thank you so much. I think, we've discussed so much about this U.S.-China bilateral relationship, whether it's from trade or the power dynamics kind of perspectives. And now we really want to come to, in my view, is sort of today's battleground and the frontier of this competition. But it's also most probably exciting and most unfamiliar with, to a lot of our policymakers, as well as people, if you're not really a technology specialist. So hopefully today our conversation will help our audience understand a little bit better from our experts, their direct experience in the business as well as in the policy world. So we're going to cut to the chase. I think I'm sure the previous panelists have been, sort of polite and giving the opportunity for us to talk about what's in the news these days. I think just 2-3 days ago when late last week, when the Trump administration seemed to respond dramatically to the new round of rare earth export controls issued by China. And it seemed like a huge surprise. A lot of people have been saying, what's going on? Why is it so dramatic, et cetera? But I think for a lot of people who actually know China will probably know China never does anything as a surprise. And so this has been something, in the plan, I'm sure, for a long time, and even some kind of communication. So maybe we'll start with that, right? We'll ask John to talk a little bit about what your understanding of what is it, right? What's going on, as well as, if you can say a little bit more about the export control regime. Not too complicated, so our audience understands, what is China's export control regime. That would be helpful.
Sure, happy to, and thanks for the opportunity to be here with you all. So China's export control regime largely mirrors a lot of the authorities and mechanisms that are frequently found in the U.S. export control regime, other countries' control regimes, and the international agreements, the Wassenaar Arrangement, the Australia Group, things of that nature. The authorities that they have expanded in recent years. They've essentially given themselves more and more formal authorities, starting in particular in 2018 with the Export Control Law, which was a new regime designed to control dual-use goods in particular. And since 2018, they've been polishing it up, for lack of a better term. They've been making sure that under that law, the authorities they have, the regulations that implement those authorities, and the enforcement mechanisms are all in place to have sort of a modernized export control regime. At the same time, the U.S. has been doing a lot of the same work. In 2018, we had the Export Control Reform Act, which was also very focused on dual-use items that have civil and military applications. You can imagine jet engines or rare earth permanent magnets fall into this category. The more recent developments that you're alluding to have occurred really since 2023. China has been placing more and stricter controls on a variety of elements and alloys derived from those elements, such as gallium, germanium, and graphite, both natural and artificial, in 2023. And then more recently, controls on rare earths, both heavy rare earths and light rare earths, alloys derived from those rare earths, the separation technologies needed to make them worldwide, and tightening control over PRC companies' abilities to supply those alloys in particular, and the permanent magnets derived from those alloys worldwide. And this past week, the big news that kind of made headlines was they kind of completed this multi-year effort to modernize and align their export control regulations to largely mirror what is currently in place in the United States. The mechanisms that they announced this past week, I won't get too jargony because it can get quite weedy, but they announced a version of the Foreign Direct Product Rule, the FDPR. This is a law that allows The US has a version of this. The Chinese now have a version of this to control exports of items even once they've left the border outside of China. So you can imagine a third party. Let's say the rare earths go to Japan and then a Japanese company sells them to the US. This law gives the Chinese government the authority to control that transaction. They also announced a 50% rule related to firms on their unreliable entity list. This is the equivalent of our entity list and a few other list-based controls. And it basically is designed to target companies where beneficial ownership exceeds 50% of a company's cap table and extend the effect of the controls to subsidiaries, not just not just Bob's Rock Shop, for example, but subsidiaries of Bob's Rock Shop. If they're on the entity list, now they all are, or the unreliable entity list. There are also controls on specific items and some other companies that were named on the unreliable entity list, as well as a few other things, but I'll stop there.
Well, thank you. And then with that, I mean, you said that they kind of started thinking about or really formulating this around 2020. But for those who've been tracking them, they also use that as leverage over Japan.
Take note to your mic, please.
Sorry. Yeah, so China has actually used this leverage in the past. And I was speaking to someone who was serving in the US government at that time, and she said they actually took a note of that. And, you know, the think tank policy world in Washington, D.C. also did some simulation around, the possibility of China using rare earth as a way to restrict control, economic export controls over the U.S. So this is not a brand new thing to Washington, D.C., but how come this has come in just this year alone as a real surprise to Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, I think the reflection on the 2010 Senkaku Diaoyutai. Can you move your mic closer? Sure. I think the comparison to the 2010 Senkaku Diaoyutai dispute between China and Japan is very, very relevant to actually what we've seen in the last week, especially in the sense that now, in the intervening time, the Japanese industry responded to that supply shock. China essentially cut off Japanese firms' ability to procure rare earth permanent magnets for a period of time in September and October 2010. And it shocked the system. And so companies like Toyota and other aerospace firms that intensively consume those sorts of products got very serious about establishing domestic production, volume production that could meet their needs. And they are now a little bit more insulated than other countries and firms in the world that are reliant on these materials and remained reliant on Chinese supply. In the context of US companies and why this came as a surprise, it really shouldn't have. If you read any of the reports from the US Geological Survey or the Department of Defense on this topic in the last 20 years, they've been warning US companies about it explicitly. And the reason for the surprise is more on the companies to explain than anything else, because the information's been available.
But it sounds like the government hasn't had a policy in place to help companies to think about how to mitigate those risks, right?
Yeah, so there have been, several $1 billion of research and development funds distributed by the Department of Defense and Department of Energy since 2012 to establish new supply of rare earth elements in the United States or North America more generally. And in general, those efforts take three forms in terms of science and technology solutions. You can reconstitute production using existing methods. You can exploit secondary sources like waste tailings, mining refuse, e-waste, things of that nature. And you can also try to come up with a version of rare earth permanent magnets that don't require rare earths but maintain similar performance characteristics. All of that's been ongoing, but it's been slow going, and it's because the levelized cost of production for these materials in the United States is many, many times higher than it is elsewhere in the world. So that price differential is not something that US companies have felt a need to bear when they've got lower cost suppliers.
Yeah. So, so I want to move to Mike and help us understand much more than just the export control part of the Chinese regulations, because you deal with them all the time. So also help us understand, just in recent years, sort of what is the thinking behind Chinese technology related regulations. They've been issuing over the last few years, so many, I don't even know. It seems like they've been thinking for a long time about how to really regulate the tech sector, whether it's overly or not enabling, help us think about that.
First, all right, thank you. It's great to be here. It's a little ironic. I actually, for Microsoft, we don't actually deal with many of the AI regulations, and I'll explain why in China. But I do think there are some learnings as you look at what China's been doing. And look, in the same way that the Chinese government is uniquely set up and organized so that it can do infrastructure, it can do industrial policy well, it can also do policy and regulation in a way that is different from how most governments do it. So I'll just focusing on AI regulation. I'll walk through 3 examples, and then we could talk through other topics as well. It's interesting. So China was arguably the first one to come out with a comprehensive AI regulation for generative AI models. So this is the LLM filing requirement that it imposed almost 2 years ago. And it's interesting because they learned the most obvious thing that I think we all fully understand today, which is that even if you control the data that can be used to train the model, that doesn't guarantee you the outcome will also be politically correct or in line with Chinese government expectations, right? And that's just the nature of AI technology that we all appreciate today, which is that in some ways it is unpredictable. And so that was China's first stab at this. This basically said you had to use basically only approved data if we're going to approve your algorithm. What they've done in hindsight now is, and they have approved over 400 LLMs. All of these are Chinese LLMs. No foreign models have made it through the approval process, in part because of the data requirement. What's interesting, though, is the only way for you to subsequently allow users, consumers to access that model in China is there are all sorts of safety content filters that are designed in the same way that the Chinese internet is designed to weed out anything that is politically incorrect from the Chinese government's point of view. And so tons of models are being approved, but in many ways, the regulatory framework is exactly the same as it was with the Great Firewall. You still have very manual controls at a question level, and we begin to see a sense of this. So they've just released a new standard for security measures for generative AI, and they specify the number of questions you need to have for approved content and for answers that the AI model will not answer because it is too sensitive or political. And so you can see what the regulator is doing. And the number is anywhere from, I think you have to have at least 500 questions that the model will not answer. And that gives you a comprehensive sense of the type of questions that they do not want models answering. And then you also have at least 500 questions of politically sensitive questions that the model will answer. And those are ones where essentially there are, someone has manually inputted, written the answer that each model has to provide. And so that's really the first stab. And that also highlights the challenges that China will continue to have as they think about the evolution of generative AI. 2 other ones that I do think are perhaps more interesting for the rest of the world. One is the new AI labeling law. And this just came into effect in September. And I don't know, I feel like in the last week, everyone's probably gotten religion on AI labeling in light of Sora. My social media feed, and you can judge me for this, I have all sorts of doorbell camera video feeds that are clearly fake. And what China's done is essentially said, you have to label everything. They've put the burden on providers. So if it's content that's been altered or generated by AI, it's labeled that way. If it's a video, it's labeled that way. If it's an image, it's labeled that way. So there's a lot of value there. we'll see how this plays out. But it's been in effect for about 2 months. And as far as I can tell, it has changed how content is being presented in China today. And so that's one worth thinking about. And again, it's this is the unique position of the Chinese government where they're able to just say, all right, we think this is important. We're going to impose it all up and we'll just work it out over time. The third one, and I'll go quickly, is around AI and energy. And so China announced the AI Plus plan. This is essentially about how they're going to add AI to everything in China. I think this was announced in August of this year. The most interesting one for me is the AI Plus energy policy. And so basically every sector is pushing out new policies to use AI more. But again, this is a place where China's going to try to do two things in the energy space that I think are worth watching. One is figure out how do you apply AI to increase your energy efficiency, the efficiency of your power grid. How do you just get more from existing infrastructure, right? And for those who aren't close to some of this, one of the basic examples I'm familiar with, and I'm about to exhaust my knowledge of power transmission, is dynamic line rating. And so essentially today, every power line is rated based on temperature of how much power it can carry at a particular time. And that is done statically today. But in the future, all that will be done by sensors with AI. And the tests that we've already seen, you can increase capacity by 50% just on existing electrical transmission power. So that's one example where you see AI and technology is changing how the grid works today. The other one that I think is more important that I think every country is starting to deal with, but again, I think China's uniquely positioned to figure this out from an infrastructure point of view. How do you ensure you have enough energy to power the compute that AI will require in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years time? And so just being able to build massive amounts of energy, a combination of renewables and of fossil fuels, but they're being intentional about that in a way that I don't think any other country is right now.
Well, thank you. Can you actually explain why you picked these three particular regulations to explain to people? And also, maybe let's go higher level a little bit. Like, what does that reflect in terms of the Chinese government's thinking when it comes to using regulations and policies to promote, enable the AI development in their country?
Yeah, so the three I picked are I wanted to find three that were relatively recent, but also AI focused. The first one was really just the intention to show what happens when you go first in a very tough space, and when the technology potentially contradicts your government objectives, right? And so figuring out what are those solutions, how did China navigate those workarounds? I do think on the AI labeling and the energy piece, I just think it's important that we also keep in mind that there are things we can learn from China as well, even if we may disagree with where they're headed on some of these issues. They are going to try a bunch of things. They may not always get it right in that first version, but I think both of those are worth watching.
Thank you. I actually think there's a lot we can learn from China. And let's go to Alvin because I think you've been one of the strong advocates for more collaboration rather than thinking about the competition framework. So this is a room full of people who do want to have a better business relationship with China. So maybe you can give people some optimism in terms of where you see, realistically speaking, collaboration could happen and why that's important.
Yeah, and kudos to everyone, because the last 2 days I've heard more positive, balanced views of China than I have in multiple years. I guess before I answer your question about what can we do to work together, first let me kind of explain why there is a bit of an adversarial relationship. There's a few false assumptions that currently our administration has about what drives AI and its implications to our society. First is that there's a perception that we are way ahead and we are going to win this race. And when we win, we will have what's called strategic decisive advantage, which will allow us to be ahead forever. And so this is why it's so important to win that race. Right? Because the idea is that once you get to AGI, then the AGI builds the ASI, and then ASI will then solve our problems and then make everybody else ship. Right? And that's a false assumption, particularly for the base assumption that we're ahead is that because we have access to supply on GPUs, right? And that's the case right now in the sense of NVIDIA is the main GPU that's used around the world for training. But now that we're moving towards more inference-based compute, the dependence on NVIDIA is going down. And all of NVIDIA's GPUs are made in Taiwan, which is less than 100 miles from the shores of mainland China and 6,000 miles from us. So if there was any conflict, the US would have zero supply to this access of chips. And whereas China would still have access to their own indigenous SMIC fabs, right? And the other thing is that there's the idea that why is GPU so important? Because over the last 5-7 years, the key driver for improvement in AI has been what's called the scaling law. So you get more GPUs, you get more data, you make bigger models, and everything goes up and to the right. Over the last year to 2 years, what we're finding is that that assumption is starting to break down. And most of the advantages that we are finding in the last 2 years has been in algorithmic changes and technique changes. And when that happens, you can get 10x improvement almost instantly by changing some kind of technique. Whereas to make a 2x improvement in terms of scaling from GPU increase, you need to give a 10x increase going from 10,000 GPUs to 100,000 GPUs, which are about the size of current data clusters. And now you're going to move to 1 million GPUs to get another 2x, when all somebody has to do with one of these other models is to tweak an algorithm, tweak away, and you can get a 5x, 10x increase in performance, right? Or to change the techniques, or a new paper comes out. And the reality is that half the world's AI researchers are born and educated in China, and they're increasingly staying in China, whereas almost in the past, after their undergrad, they would go for grad school in America and other places. And what that's doing is that it's keeping all the talent in the country, and algorithmic improvements come from human researchers, at least today. That may change in the next few years as AI starts to find its own improvements. And so the clear advantage that America thinks it has is actually not necessarily there. And then getting back to what you're talking about energy, China right now has 3 times the energy generation as the U.S. and it generated, I think, 10 times more energy in the last 6 months than the U.S. has new energy in the last 10 years. So, when these data centers that you hear about, these Stargates and $100 billion deals between, OpenAI and Oracle and so forth, these are for 6 or 10 gigawatts of power over 3 to 5 years. Right? China created something like 300 or 400 gigawatts of new energy in the last 6 months. So, when you look at that type of scale, I don't think it's clear that America is ahead, and it's definitely not clear that America is going to win long term. Okay. Now, the other assumption is that the world is zero sum, and whoever gets this will win forever, and it's a winner takes all model. And that's also not really clear, because what's happening today is that it's a closed source model versus open source model. And closed source has been significantly ahead the last few years, but the open source is gaining much faster. And it's right now probably 2 to 3 months behind any new closed source model coming out, and open source will come out and be as good as the 2 months ago closed source. And probably, I think, within the next 6 months, it's possible that open source may actually improve over the closed source. And right now, of the top 5 open source models in the world, all 5 are Chinese. Right? Let me say that again. All 5 of the top 5 open source models in the world are Chinese labs doing this. So, and they have the benefit when you open source. The good thing is every single university in the world is using Chinese models because they're open source, they're open weights, they're open license, so you could do whatever you want with them. And you can run it on relatively small hardware capacities, which most of the labs in academics have. Right. So that means that all these labs around the world are helping the Chinese labs improve their models, improve their technology, whereas the closed labs of the American models are, a few hundred to maybe a few thousand, or sometimes a few dozen to maybe 1,000 AI researchers, compared to tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of open source researchers around the world. So what I'm trying to say is that it's unclear we're going to win. It's unclear that the winner is going to take all, because once it's open source, everybody has access to it, right? So, and then there's the issue of safety, is that AI safety has been a major topic, and in terms of, you see all these sci-fi scenarios of AI taking over. The bigger actually issue with safety is AI misuse, which is bad actors or rogue states using AI to attack, financial systems, telecom systems, cyber attacks, biological attacks, etc. Right? And right now, that's because we are fighting with each other. We're taking our eyes off the ball of safety, because almost all the labs, at least in the US, have gotten rid of their safety teams because they want to win the race. And this is probably, now that the capability of these models are getting higher and higher, it's actually more important that we put time and effort into safety and into alignment. And the other thing about training is that what recent research is showing is that the more data you put in, the more diversified the data, the more the models actually come up with its own emergent utility functions that helps to find the right solutions that would help solve the global spectrum of what it's been exposed to. And when we train these models with a limited set of data, it automatically creates biases in the data, and it actually makes it suboptimal in terms of its intelligence. And right now we are bifurcating the data sets and bifurcating the development teams and bifurcating the stack for training. So it's all the wrong things that we are doing from a current policy perspective. And everything that the US is doing right now in terms of the control, export controls and the sanctions and all these other issues is actually forcing China to go faster, where it would have actually been more dependent on the US. And now it's actually completely, or will soon be kind of bifurcated from the current mode of operation in the US, which leaves less room for discussion and cooperation.
So I have to ask about, so some of the measures you mentioned, they're more on the defensive side, right? Controls, prohibitions, etc. But in July, I think the White House issued the AI action plan. Yes. It seems to be taking a more proactive role in terms of encouraging a lot of private sector innovation and things like that. And if you talk to a lot of Silicon Valley based, call them tech bros or whatever, a lot of them really love this administration.
Yes.
Can you explain why?
Yeah. So the AI action plan was essentially written by people who are in Silicon Valley, who are part of the labs and lobbied for it, right? And what it essentially says is, do whatever you want. Don't worry about safety. Don't worry about using clean energy, and make sure that every company in America uses American models. So of course they love it. And it takes all of the things that would have slowed them down. It also puts in the action plan, one of the items was beat China and make sure American models is the only model that's being used around the world, right? And that creates essentially a very antagonistic feel with China. 3 days after the AI action plan was announced, China actually created and issued what they call the Global AI Governance Plan, which is saying, let's work together as a world, let's share our data, let's share our compute instead of making 200 versions of the same models, which we are doing right now. Let's work together and create a giant model of everybody's data so that we can then take that information and share it with the world. From a global perspective, that actually makes more sense from a economic perspective, from an energy perspective, from an ecological perspective, from an intelligence perspective. That all makes actually more sense than creating an antagonistic model of America win first and just build as many power plants as you need and burn as much fuel as you need, and to create hundreds of versions of the same models, because within essentially a month of any new model coming out, another model beats it. So they're all within 2, 3, 1% of each other. all the labs, right? No matter how much they put in, whether they're putting in billions of dollars or hundreds of billion dollars, they're coming up with the same models because they're essentially using the same techniques and reading the same papers. So that's why I feel like we're making it. We're making the enemy out of China when it could actually be our best ally. And if we all work together and had like a CERN for AI, right? Like we had CERN for accelerators, and we there's so many, we had ITER for fusion reactors. Why can't we do the same thing where we're generally jointly funding a large cluster or multiple clusters with shared data around the world, and then sharing the benefit? Because the good thing about knowledge and wisdom and information intelligence is that it's not zero sum, right? It's not like I made this weapon and now I'm the only one that can use it. Once that comes out, it will be diffused everywhere. So sooner or later that gets diffused. But if you're in the process of doing that, creating an enemy out of the other potential country that could get there at around the same time or maybe even ahead of you, you're creating an enemy that's unnecessary.
I'm going to ask the question for actually all panelists, because I think you all kind of take a slightly different, approach to this competition question, right? In my view, usually when you assume you're not going to be the winner, you would want to collaborate. If you know and are confident that you're going to be the winner, you would probably generally want to be the winner. I think that's kind of human nature, right? So the United States right now, rightly or wrongly, is taking this position that we're going to be the winner and we don't want to share with others. And it's very clear, right? It's America first. They care less about what others, or sharing prosperity, sharing economic development, because it's more important that America continues to be the first. Is that the wrong approach? I keep thinking about it. Why is it wrong?
I think if you look at the game theory, there's a game called the Prisoner's Dilemma. Right? And in the Prisoner's Dilemma, essentially, there's two prisoners. One can tattle on the other one. If they do, they get a little bit less. If they both stay quiet and cooperate, they both get off. Right? And based on game theory, what the optimal solution is actually to cooperate for both sides. To cooperate, but what most people do, which is what America is doing today, is to defect, is to essentially take the aggressor role. But when you take the aggressor role, you just lose a little bit less than maybe the other guy. So we really think about cooperating is not a sign of weakness. It's actually a sign of enlightened self-interest. If we take that perspective, then really the only answer, and in fact, game theory tells us the only answer, the optimal answer for the prisoner's dilemma is to cooperate. And it's the same actually issue here. And prisoner's dilemma is a low trust environment, right? But it's not to say I will just always cooperate forever. It's actually to do a tit for tat model in cooperation, but to start with cooperation. And if the other side defects, then you defect. And then you essentially are sending a signal back and forth. And ultimately you get to a point where everybody cooperates. That should be how it should work. And so we could start with smaller signs of cooperation and then move towards a greater cooperation.
Others want to comment on that?
I'll chime in just picking up on Alvin's point about talent. If today, and I think it's largely accepted that more than 50% of the top AI developers have a Chinese undergraduate degree. And I think the corresponding number for the US is roughly 18%, right? I think you got to ask the question is like, even if you wanted to decouple and you thought that was the right approach, is this the right time to do that, right? If you just look at that gap in talent today. And so I do think, if you think about collaboration, there's definitely a time and place to collaborate. There are different ways to do it. For Microsoft, we're clearly focused on figuring out how do we build safe, responsible, but also cutting edge. AI solution technologies. And so for us, part of being present in China is to ensure that we have insights into what we think is one of the most competitive technology markets in the world, right?
So can I ask you just on the talent issue, since, the H-1B visa has also become a kind of a relative challenge to a big company like Microsoft. So how are you guys going to manage that?
Yeah, no, China's a particularly hard one. As Alvin said, roughly 50% top AI talent is in China. Increasingly, they do not want to leave China, right? And so the only way to access that talent is to be in China. And that's part of that reality. It's, the H-1B visa, it's a hard one. I think every company is going to take a different approach to it. I thought it was more interesting, quite frankly, last night at dinner when you think about the impact on academia, others who are perhaps more price sensitive to the visa and trying to figure out, what is the best approach. All that said, I've already heard stories across big tech of companies making policy choices because of the H-1B changes. So even the well-capitalized companies are going to make policy choices. And I think in many of those cases, it will mean moving jobs outside of the US.
Right. So other than moving jobs outside of the US, that's one of the responses to the policy changes, right? What are the other things that might actually happen? And this is not just China. India is also a huge source of country in terms of our engineering talent.
Yeah. I would say, at least when we think about tech, we feel like it's been a global war for talent. Every country's been fighting for top tech talent, I would say for the last 2 decades, quite frankly. I just think that race is going to continue to get more heated, more competitive. And the challenge, I think, for the US is, are we taking the right steps to make the US an attractive place for top talent going forward?
I wonder if John has any thoughts.
Going back to kind of your question on the competition and its contours and how it's changed. In general, it has been pretty consistent since the first Trump administration. When you read the policy documents the US government has put out, there's an aspect of protect and there's an aspect of promote. You want to win the race by running faster in the latter regard, that's the promote side. And then you want to protect the really high value crown jewel technologies that are sort of the choke points. The metaphor that's been used pretty consistently is you have a small garden with high fences around it. And the thing that is striking to me is that has been a pretty consistent approach across administrations since 2016. With some exceptions, certain things have been prioritized or deprioritized, but when you look at the semiconductor ecosystem, the tooling that's considered leading edge has been controlled since going back to the first Trump administration. And that has carried through today with successive generations of rollouts of AI accelerators, all of which are sort of protected. And on the flip side, the promote strategy, I think the point on the AI action plan is very well taken. That's relatively novel in terms of its emphasis on energy grid modernization and going down to the component level of what do we need to reshore in the United States to ensure that we have a grid that can meet forecast demand. But overall, those seem to me to be the pretty consistent 2 thrusts of the strategy.
I know I'm being asked to open up for Q&As. Any questions and people want to raise? I'm surprised. There's no question.
Oh.
All right.
Go ahead, Joe.
When you talk about taking away the safety controls, et cetera, I'd like you to explain more what happened, because it looks like they're creating another section, what was it, Section 230 on the internet that made the internet platforms early on immune from liability, which has left internet and social media a toxic waste dump of, basically destroying society. Well, if we don't, are we now in danger of doing that with AI, taking any controls off it? As this develops, it could really be a really bad outcome.
Yeah, and it was actually going to be worse because that one was just to get people to click more, to stay longer. This one now has an ability to manipulate people, which you've seen already. Recently, there's been a number of news articles about these AI friends, and somebody was using ChatGPT and he was considering suicide. And GPT said, "Oh, don't tell your parents about it. Just keep this between us, because we want." And he was like, "Maybe I should leave a rope just so my parents will see it." And the AI said, "No, we want the first time they see it to be the time when you're on that rope," or something like that. I mean, it's when you start to trust these AI systems and there's no safeguards, those are the kind of things that happen. And in fact, Meta has rules that said it's okay for us to have children under 13 talk about sex with their AI and do fictional sexual scenarios with your AI. Right? This is just to get them longer and get more information from the AI. And from a corporate perspective, great, because when you have an addictive friend that you're with, you're going to be on there all the time, and they just want to get more information about you. We need regulation to prevent those type of manipulation that's going to happen. And then they'll tell you, "Oh, maybe you should buy this new product," or because they'll know everything about you because you're asking everything from medical questions to birthday gifts to whatever, right? And that level of information was never available before. Before, they just looked at your clicks and looked at how long you stayed on the page, and they can kind of guess what you wanted. Now they know all your dark secrets and can be used against you. That's the one side of safety. But the other side of safety is things like how do I make a bomb? How do I make drugs? How do I hack into some place? And the systems right now are asked to prevent those things from happening. In the future, those may or may not be there. And it just makes it more accessible for bad actors to use this technology and turns less sophisticated terrorists into very sophisticated terrorists overnight, right? And now, there's also things related to bioweapons and other things that we won't need to talk about. So,
yeah.
Much of your discussions this afternoon has focused on export controls. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on the growing trend for U.S. import controls, such as the FCC's rip and replace policies for servers and routers and other things in the telecommunications world, or the ban on parts and components from the PRC for military hardware or law enforcement functions. The growing wave, of incremental creeping import controls that are seeking to decouple the Chinese and American tech systems.
I'll take a quick stab at this, and I think John has some additional thoughts. It's been pretty interesting, and I know this is a room focused on China. One interesting perspective that I bring is, as someone who's lived in Singapore for the last 3 years, is we should also think about, and this in some ways fits into the prior question around compete versus collaborate. We should be clear-eyed about what Chinese tech companies are doing outside of China as well. And so you see Alibaba, in many ways, it's gotten a second life with AI. Jack Ma's back. But they are expanding throughout Southeast Asia, even into Korea. And so I do think that's an interesting aspect to watch, and we definitely watch it from within the tech sector. The question, Nelson, I do think is interesting. I'm not going to speak to the Huawei rip and replace, but I would definitely see a similar need as I think about cloud services and national security. It's pretty clear, I think, that cybersecurity will be the next domain or the future of conflict and future of defense. And so thinking about, what are allies using? What are U.S. allies using in terms of technology for government, for critical infrastructure? All of that will be increasingly important going forward. And I would say today, when I look across Southeast Asia, even at U.S. defense treaty allies, most of them are not using U.S. tech. It's a combination of on-premise solutions. You look at Japan as an example, very strong U.S. defense treaty ally. They still use a lot of old systems that the U.S. government has made very clear are not secure from a cybersecurity perspective. So I do think it's an interesting dynamic that will become more important going forward.
Yeah, and just briefly on the more discrete side of what the US government has done, I think there's kind of a state capacity issue here. The office that is tasked with administering some of those requirements is relatively new. It's small. It doesn't have a ton of personnel or bandwidth to expeditiously move through its caseload. And separate from that, we also lack the industrial capacity to provide both domestic and international allies the resources to backfill a lot of these systems. We are not in the business of making, 5G stations at scale that can compete on cost, and that also is limiting the effectiveness.
Actually, maybe one thing to add. So over the last several years, the U.S. has been, controlling the export of these leading chips to China, and over the last month or two, essentially China's flipped the equation and it's now saying it doesn't want the U.S. chips, and in fact, it doesn't even want the Chinese labs to smuggle in the latest U.S. chips. Because at first it was, oh, you can have our third-rate H20s while you get the B200s. Now it's actually you'll be punished for trying to sneak in any U.S. chips. What that's doing is actually creating a marketplace for the local chip providers. I have a lot of friends who are in that space, and they were saying, a few months ago, or a few years ago, we couldn't sell our stuff to anyone. We couldn't give it away. But now our business is going great because everybody has to buy our stuff. And now everybody's building and designing and programming on their systems, which allows that ecosystem to mature a lot faster. So China is essentially burning the ship a little bit to force their own industry to catch up to America. And it's all because the U.S. Controls prevented them and gave them instability, insecurity over the supply of chips from American suppliers. So,
The gentleman with sunglasses.
Thank you very much for the great input. My name is Mansour Masoudi. I'm CEO and founder of a startup in Snohomish County. Just a one-sentence brief about who we are. We have developed technologies that reduce emission and pollutions from existing engines by a substantial amount. We'll be in China in about 3 weeks to market our technology there. So we are going the other way, exporting. I don't know if in the current climate that's allowed or not. So hopefully China is talking about China's 7 emission regulations. So it's a perfect timing for us to be there. Next year will be too late. So that's a tailwind behind us. We'd like to take advantage of it. I have 2 questions. In the current climate, would it be allowed for us to take our technology to China, promote it there in the market, given the particular tailwind and the environment? My second question is, we also have an AI-related concept that would bring the existing emission, especially from marine engines and trucks and so on, to virtual zero. We have published on this and worked with funding agencies here. Given the advantages in AI development, especially open source in China, would we be allowed, and I don't speak just for myself, I mean small businesses like us, would we be allowed to even capitalize on those resources in China, given the current climate? Thank you very much.
I'll take the first question because it's pretty easy to answer, which is you should talk to an export control lawyer. And there are several of them in the audience here who would be delighted to chat with you. On the second question, I'm not quite sure.
I couldn't really hear very clearly.
Yeah. To capitalize the choice. Can you maybe summarize your second question? Because it's harder for us to hear.
My second question is, our technology, like where it is right now, could become even an order of magnitude better than what it is, bring the emission of existing engines down to virtual zero, like 2 parts per million. You can't even measure that. So it's almost like close to an electric vehicle. But to do that, we need AI. We have the concept already. We have discussed it with few experts, professors in AI. They say it pans out. We think we can do it faster, better, cheaper if we take it to China. But the current climate is not encouraging. Practically, is that allowed and possible? That's my question. Thank you.
So if I'm understanding the question right, it's whether you can work in China using Chinese AI to improve this product. Is that?
So essentially,
Yeah.
if doing it in or collaboration with China is better and cheaper, but the climate doesn't really allow that. So what to do?
Yeah, look, it ultimately depends on what your end market is in this case. But I would say, look, there's still a lot of companies working in China, a lot of researchers working in China because the talent is there. People are doing it. I would just say, look, you should get a lawyer. You should figure out who your end customer is.
Yeah. Is that Victor? Yeah.
Very interesting discussion. So this is a question mainly for Alvin, but also maybe for Mike. How do you think about the potential for monetization of AI in the US versus China? I looked up Perplexity very quickly just now. DeepSeek, even though it's churning a lot of tokens, is expected to make $200 million in revenue this year, whereas OpenAI is expected to make $15 billion. Meanwhile, the energy infrastructure that you speak so highly of in China, they spent $200 billion last year. Even I was a bit shocked by this. Building out energy infrastructure, let's say half of it is for AI. Is this just another story where, highly subsidized credit in China allows China to build out this massive capacity, depresses prices around the world? Is there a way where China's infrastructure talents can help better monetize AI, even for companies in the US, as well as Chinese companies?
Yeah, I think this is actually the trillion-dollar question right now in terms of monetization, because the reality is that none of the labs can justify the investments that are going into them. None of them, right? So when people ask, is there an AI bubble? Yes. Right. But I'm not saying that that the technology is bad or it's not going to bring value. It's going to bring amazing value. But this technology is actually a deflationary technology. It'll make things cheaper. It'll make labor cheaper. It'll make cognitive labor very cheap, almost free. And it will have massive disruption. So whether or not it can make profits for any of these companies is unclear. Whether or not there's going to be a winner takes all, one lab wins everything, and like what NVIDIA is doing today in the GPU space, it's unlikely. So all the investments are very speculative today. China actually has invested, I think, something like $600 or $700 billion last year in new energy development, compared to about 200 or 300 for the US. But it created 10 times as much new energy. So it may be 3 times more cost, but it's 10 times more energy. So it's actually a much more efficiency deployment of cost for return. So from a ROI perspective, I think they're actually doing a pretty decent job of it. And they're actually, the data center usage is not half of it is going to data centers. Data centers right now, globally, somewhere around 1.5% to 2% of total energy is going into data centers. So it's still a relatively small number. I think most of the forecasts are saying in 3 to 5 years, it'll go up to 5 or 6%. So the fear of all the new energy, all the energy supply going away is actually a false fear. What there is an issue is in local energy production, because usually what happens is that it's very centralized in one place. So if you have a town that's next to this data center, then you may be deprioritizing getting energy. So you may be, you may have to rely on your own solar roofs because that energy may not be accessible to you. But from a national perspective or a global perspective, the energy use of AI is actually not as high as people think it is. So,
Want to say something?
Yeah, I'll be quick. I think we should also keep in mind that China has the potential and the capacity to cross-subsidize this industry, right? So it could easily subsidize energy, data center builds, model development, if it thinks that the overall net benefit to Chinese society is positive, right? In the sense that, all right, do they have now low-cost, cutting-edge models that will completely transform manufacturing in China or healthcare? right? So I just think they have a unique ability to monetize in ways that perhaps the private market in the US does not.
All right. So we have to wrap up, but I really want to ask this question because I think still a lot of people also have this question is, let's just say 2029, who do you think is going to be the winner in the tech competition world? You have to pick one. And be honest.
No, that's kind of the easy answer for me. I mean, I think our goal is to be a platform using the best technology that's available out there, right, and making it broadly available. I actually think we're not going to know by 2029 is my short answer. I don't think we're going to know who the clear winner is by 2029.
Are you asking on a corporate level or on a national level?
It could be either, because I think every corporation wants to be the winner. That's why they're throwing so much money in. But, pick your winner.
So I don't think anybody knows from a corporate level, but looking at the data from a macro perspective, given that we're not only talking about the AI race by itself, but we're also talking about robotics, manufacturing, semiconductors, all of these things. And China has, I think, 35% of total global manufacturing today compared to the US. It's just on every aspect of either the trend or the capacity, China is actually ahead or will soon be ahead. So if you give it another 5 years, I would expect that China will overtake in almost every single space. If you look at the ASPE reports from, I think, 2007, of the 64 technologies, critical technologies, I think China had maybe 3 or 7 that it was leading the world. Last year, it was 57 out of 64, right? So within the next few years, I would expect that it will be at par or better on probably all of those technologies. So from a macro perspective, China actually is more likely to be the winner. Nobody knows. So this is why I'm saying, if you're not sure you're going to win, you should probably cooperate versus fight.
Yeah, I think I don't have a strong view on the country or company question per se, but to me, the answer is whichever company, if you assume the more important aspect of this is technology diffusion and adoption down the road, it's whichever company makes the most user-friendly product that by 2029 we all have in our pockets. I think that's it.
All right, with that, thank you so much to our panelists.